Hi, folks. Welcome to the Public AI seminar. Today, we are uh, honored to be joined by Martin Tisné. Hopefully, I'm not butchering that.
That was good. That's good.
Okay. I had uh, a look through Martin's resume slash bio the other day, and it was just like, oh my gosh, this is too much. Incredibly impressive. I think the short version of this is Martin is a philanthropic entrepreneur, currently leading the AI Collaborative, part of the Omidyar Group, supporting a lot of work around public interest, democratic access to AI for the public good. But previously did things with the Obama White House, helped set up AI Now, AWO, which I had no idea. I remember Alex and I were collaborating with some folks in AWO. And now is leading a bunch of work in the EU and abroad vis-a-vis public interest AI, which hopefully we'll hear a little bit shortly now. With that, I will pass it to you, Martin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so given the chat that we had last week and given what I've read about what you guys are working on the Airbus for AI and other ventures, I thought I might, and so basically given the applied nature of your work, I thought I might give a little bit sort of a representation which builds up to where we stand with current AI right now, but also really gives the story from a policy engagement perspective of what we did in order to help make the summit happen in February, and then how it happened and some lessons learned around that. So hopefully that's useful. And from what my understanding of the next 55 minutes or so, it should also give plenty of time for any questions to go deeper. So I checked, I should be able to share my screen there. So our presentation, can you see that okay? Is that fine? Yeah. So
Yep.
let me just go into, all right, so you don't get bothered by stuff. So I just wanted to sort of, rewind the story a little bit and you tell me sort of what's helpful or not. I think what it started with was basically, the decision to host what became the AI Action Summit in February. And that really started in late 23 in the run up to Bletchley Park in late October and early November 23. And, the initial thinking and the strategy around that. And if, as you will all recall, it feels like light years away now, but a focus that was very much around the potential catastrophic risk associated with artificial intelligence, an important topic, and one that we felt also would be important to balance with opportunities as well as short-term risks. So there was a lot of thinking around that there. Then going from January to June 24, really thinking about like what the vision was and like hopefully gather some momentum. What I would say there is in some ways, maybe, I mean, you be the judges, similar to where you are now, perhaps. Like we felt that we had an opportunity to work at a different scale than we'd all been working at before, and to just really take advantage of this moment that we were going to be living through over the next 12 months to try and think at a different scale. You were very generous in your introduction, Josh. Like I've helped set up, organizations which amazing people have led, AI Now, AWO, and others. And I've also, not in the case of those two organizations, had some frustration over the past like 10, 15 years or so of having been involved in a lot of like very smart projects, but not worked at a scale which is really shifting the dial enough when we talk about the business model of these like technology behemoths that are really impacting our lives in different ways. So scale was a big part of it. And the other one, and I'll come to it, was just like thinking about ways to be as collaborative as possible and engage and be really transparent with the field in terms of what we were doing. So that was really the first half of 24. Second half of 24 was like further consultation. My colleague Vidushi Mada and I over the summer were working up the first draft, then consulted on that basis, refined the strategy, and then did the final push in the first 2 months of 25, just to give a little bit of a sort of, taking a step back there. So the analysis that we did was, I'd say, fourfold, with one simple point at the beginning in terms of an affirmative vision. I, as no doubt you as well, had been in just like too many meetings where we all agreed we needed an affirmative vision for the sector, but then sort of like got wrapped into sort of how to do it and having a meeting about having an affirmative vision, which kind of went nowhere. And so from that perspective, wanted to be, you know, rooted and grounded in like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What are the gaps? The first one being fragmentation, as in it's not for lack of smart public interest ventures around the world. It's how they are working together and how they are coordinated in the face of basically, you know, a bunch of relatively vertically integrated, you know, very large technology companies. So the fragmentation in the field, how do we solve for that? The second one, just at a basic level, is the scale mismatch. You know, like one party's talking about millions, the other one is talking about billions, but at the same time, not to be bullied by that. Like there were a lot of conversations that we ended up in, which felt a little bit like, you know, and I'll come to this in a second. You know, if you don't have 100 billion, like you might as well not get up in the morning. You know, and I'll come back to that. That's something that we really wanted to challenge. The third one is, as you know better than I do, just like missing infrastructure in the field. And I use infrastructure in the sort of the large, you know, well, not loose sense, but the sort of large sense of the term there, both sort of civil society infrastructure, tech infrastructure, and overall, like, and I'll talk about it in a second, like the infrastructure to make open source AI really work and really sing. And then the last one were like overlooked challenges. I mean, less so now, but early, I'd say still in early 24, focus on climate and focus on sustainability and trying to integrate that in our thinking rather than create yet another silo. So that's some gaps. So the first thing that we did was to say, look, it's really not just about compute. It's about compute, but it's also about data, and to position Europe firmly as a leader when it comes to data, but that it's not enough. You know, I will just to quote, pretty sure it wasn't Chatham House rules, so I'll quote Alondra Nelson at the summit in a panel that I was really like thrilled to moderate, probably the best panel I've ever had the chance to moderate, which was around data. There, and Alondra was rightly saying, Professor Nelson was saying, there's been a huge amount of innovation when it comes to compute and very little innovation actually when it comes to data, comparatively speaking. And so shifting the focus and saying, right, like from a compute perspective, you may need, you know, billions as a unit of analysis, but when it comes to data, what I was saying a lot in the run up to the summit is that money alone isn't what will get you the good data. We need better availability, accessibility of data. When we're talking about health data, it's also a fundamental question of trust. And there is so much more that we need to do there. And if it's not a question of trust, because we're not talking about unlocking data by having data trusts or what have you, and if it's a technical question, then it's also not one where you need billions. So a focus saying like data is a critical component here, and we, you know, don't believe the hype that data is no longer an important factor in AI. That was one. The second one is broadening the scope, saying like we're not just interested in like big. It's not a question of the big is always better. We're not optimizing for AGI. We're interested in small models. I mean, in some ways that seems kind of obvious today. It felt a lot less obvious in March, April last year. The third one, which I think is going to continue to be one of the, I was just talking about this in meeting today, one of the biggest challenges for what then became current AI, which is saying, and I think that's maybe similar, you be the judge as to what you're doing, that it is entirely possible, and not only possible, but necessary to walk a ridgeline between AI and the public interest and economic goals. And so a lot of our thinking was to say, how do we get public money for public AI? And in order to do that, we need to prove the hypothesis that, so, you know, AI in the public interest being how to actually cure different forms of cancer when you suffer from them, right? On one hand, and on the other hand, how is that also beneficial from an economic perspective and in the interest economically of your country? So how effectively, when we're talking to the governments, can we be talking both to the finance ministry and the health ministry? What does that look like? So that's a third one. And what was interesting, the fourth one, is that for those of you, maybe many of you who were involved, there were a number of different working groups that we were running in parallel in the run-up to the AI Action Summit. There was the one I ran on public interest AI, and there was another one on innovation. And what was super interesting, I hadn't anticipated that at all. In line with what we were hoping for in point 3, is that actually came to be a pretty natural alignment between the two. Like the startups in the innovation working group were asking for things that were very similar to what we were hearing in the public interest AI working group. It sounds maybe a little bit obvious now. It really was a big surprise to me. from that perspective, and that was very cool, and it helped us get a lot of momentum. Um, I'll jump through those a little bit. I mean, I think one of our surprises, and again, it may or not resonate with the work that you're doing, is that we were just like, I remember telling the team a little over a year ago that we were really ready. We were like, okay, we're going to have to make compromises. How is this going to happen? In the end, I actually made like relatively little compromises in terms of the course that we'd set. I hope that we had a fairly sort of clear and shared purpose, which I'll talk about in a second. And I was actually in my team as well. We were surprised as to the degree the vision actually held firm through to the launch of current AI. Um, a little bit sort of tricky to exactly assess why that was, but it's interesting that we spend less time and less political capital, burning less political capital, compromising at that stage than I thought we might. And I think actually we can talk about this. I think the compromise is going to start now, a little bit more. Piece on civil society engagement. We involved civil society in pretty much all key meetings and discussions. It definitely wasn't perfect. Would love to give more feedback as to how it could be done better, but tried as much as possible to ensure that there was that participation both in formal consultation processes and informal ones, and contributing to the thinking and the governance, the design of the governance and decision making around what we were setting up. So I spoke about this a little bit. We were framing public interest as a case of public funding, and then we're engaging with literally dozens of different country partners. And what we were aiming to do was to have as much as possible proportionate geographic representation. So we were aiming for a couple of countries per region, regions very broadly defined. So the Americas, a couple of countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, a couple of countries, Europe, etc., Asia. There's a penny that dropped for us towards like kind of Q4 2024, which was, and I've been involved in the past with a number of different charters. I think with some of you on this call with the Open Data Charter back in 2013, 2014, and others. Like charters, they can sometimes just like not really be worth the paper that they're written on, and sometimes they serve a purpose. The reason, to be clear, that we spent the time developing the Paris Charter for Public Interest AI was twofold. One of them was to avoid kind of like public interest AI washing, basically just meaning everyone having their own definition of it and it basically meaning nothing. And then we sign something, we go home. So we wanted to write black on white, like this is what we mean by it at this point in time. You sign up to this document, you need to agree to that. That's one. And arguably that still can be a little bit wishy-washy, but it's better than nothing. But really the aim of the Paris Charter was that in order to get countries to financially contribute in different ways, and I'm happy to speak about that more. We're in the throes of it right now. In signing the charter, they committed to defining a contribution by the 30th of June this year. So that was really important. So I think that was a learning for us, and we'll see how it goes. But in order to gather up states' contributions, which for some were possible by like a deadline, definitely sharpens the mind, and for some it was possible by the 11th of February, and some it just wasn't. For the German government, in the throw, like running up to the election, it just wasn't possible. But the summit definitely created that pressure. Private sector engagement, that's something that we thought about a lot. And then when somewhat sort of towards the end, at the very beginning of Q1, effectively tiered the engagement with the private sector, saying, okay, we've got 4 tiers. We want to work with startup founders who benefit from and are jazzed up about having a more functioning, more resilient, open ecosystem around artificial intelligence. The second one, that was actually, the first one was relatively straightforward to identify people and they were excited to join, and many of our champions are from that group. The second one we're still working on. That was the trickiest one. So we'd love to get people's thoughts on that. It may again or not be relevant for you, but that's like non-tech companies, buyers of AI products, especially for us, non-tech companies who are buyers of open, right, AI products, and are interested in, serving their clients better in different ways. So that is a super important one from our perspective, and one we're still working on. I mean, we're all still working on it because now we're building this big startup. The third one are tech companies who have a similar incentive to the one I just mentioned in terms of the open products, but sit outside of big tech and the frontier labs. That's why we're so excited to get Salesforce on board, right? And then the fourth one was like a limited engagement with big tech and frontier labs, basically having one partner. And that's why we partnered with DeepMind in a very specific way around science data on that. So there was a lot of engagement by different tech companies on it, as you can imagine. So we really needed to have a very clear strategy there, and I think that was helpful for everyone involved. Um, so the artist formerly known as AI Foundation for Public Interest and became Current AI, the aim is and was creating an open public AI ecosystem accessible by and for all. We can talk about it a little bit more in the discussion. So we have basically we have a tripartite focus. One of them is making valuable data sets, public and private, accessible in privacy preserving ways. The second one is boosting the resilience of the open ecosystem, basically making it, there's a lot of chat about openness in AI and open source AI, but relatively little investment in the actual resilience of the open source AI, and I'm using open source in inverted commas here, ecosystem so that it's better, easier, more seamless to use open products and proprietary products. That's why we launched Roost, robust and open trust and safety tools at the summit. The second one. And then the third one is really around deliberation and accountability. And I mean, we need to find better ways to talk about this. We're falling into jargon a little bit when we talk about accountability in AI. Fundamentally, it's we need to be much better overall as a field and to put serious money towards it to understand the impact of artificial intelligence when the rubber hits the road and is impacting people and impacting society. One thing I often say, and I would love to be proven wrong, I'm sitting in London right now. I don't know a single person who can really tell me how AI is being used in home care right now in the United Kingdom and what we can learn from that. And if I think about the impact of social media, for example, on teens, wouldn't it have been amazing if in 2011, 2012, before things started to really sort of go in different directions, we'd had like baseline studies on how social media was impacting, for example, teen girls, was impacting self-harming teen girls, and then how would we then have changed things over the past 13 years? So that's really what we're aiming for, what we're hoping there. I don't want to run out of time too much. That's been sort of 15 minutes. So I'm going to go a little bit faster and then so make sure we have enough time for conversations. Push to the finish line. A lot that we learned there. The buggy pulpit is an impression we were using a lot when I was working with the first Obama White House. So like really using the easy from that perspective and putting pressure on different actors to join. That was both really fun, super stressful, and actually I think pretty effective. A lot of external events that came to sort of, like buffet us in different ways. Stargate, the announcement, DeepSeek on the 20th of January. So just in terms of everything you're doing, the degree to which, especially when artificial intelligence is like the driver of news almost on a day-to-day basis, that was just, a pretty amazing series of announcements that in the end, I think we were very lucky to benefit from in a major way. Happy to talk about that more if it's helpful. I'm going to skip on this one though in terms of time. So yeah, the building phase right now. So what we're doing right now is we're building this venture. We're building this public-private partnership, which is primarily, but not only, a financing vehicle called Current AI. We're working on the stakeholders, the governance, the financing, the pilots. Happy to talk about that more. Many of you will be aware of that. That's our logo. That's the launch. That's my thank you. Thanks.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Martin. There's one question I'm going to save for the spicy section on the French political turmoil and what exactly that's referencing. But I want to ask you a question that I get asked all the time. So you had a little comment there around big versus small models. You said this is obvious now. Like, actually, I really want to ask this question because, like, is it obvious first off? And what does this suggest about, like, what is the product that you're actually building that people are using? I'm going to color that even a little bit further by saying something that I've been talking about and hearing from the public labs is around this idea of data flywheels. So you were talking about making current AI, making data accessible. And I'm kind of curious how you are thinking about the sustainability of that and whether that is part of your product vision.
Yeah, it's a great question. We spoke about it a little bit last week. Look, sure, I exaggerated a little bit in terms of like it's all obvious now. I think there's a certain like segment of folks looking at AI who now is larger than it was a year ago, excited about small models. And what I meant and what I mean by that is like, what are we optimizing for? Like ultimately for current AI, we're not looking at AGI. We're optimizing for the public interest. We're optimizing, we're problem driven. So if we're problem driven and what we're looking at is looking at the intersection of AI and cancer. If within that, we're not just looking at, I don't mean to minimize it, but we're not looking at the prevention side, but we're looking at the cure once you have it. And then in particular types of cancer, we want to be talking, we are talking with oncologists. We want to see the degree to which it's important to access treatment outcome data, genetic data, what that looks like, So that's what I meant in terms of effectively pretty focused data. That is, we won't be building the products, but we are talking and helping those who are, and then effectively building the data banks, financing the technical innovations potentially that enable that data to be used is one of the pieces. And then finally, to your last point, I totally agree with you. I mean, in terms of the data flywheel, I'll quote you to you in this one, which is like maybe not specific, but I think, the point about like using and benefiting from like the use of AI in the public sector to have this data flywheel so that we basically get feedback, and reflexivity in terms of knowing how it's being used relatively rapidly, I think is exciting. Definitely, like the example I gave is not the best example of that. That's not where that's going to happen first glance. But I'm excited to, for us to launch different areas that will do just that.
Amazing. Okay, I'm just going to just run this fast and let's get some rapid fire questions. A quick thing, obviously, do raise your hand if you want to enter the queue. If you want to jump the queue, raise 2 fingers, just note something that's really relevant. And I will pass to Katie. Oh, and please introduce yourself when you first speak. And if you if you have the capacity, please turn on your cameras so we can have a more collegial environment in the Zoom. Katie.
Hi, I'm a postdoc at Harvard. I'm about to join the computer science faculty at the University of Sydney. And I kind of loosely study large language models and writing and how it impacts writing and education. But I was curious to hear more about like the different sectors you see this being a public interest technology. Like you've mentioned the cancer case. But like how do you see the kind of what are the big public interest angles for AI in your mind?
Am I taking, thank you so much. Josh, are we taking them one by one or a group? What's best?
Let's just do it one by one.
Yeah, cool. Sorry. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that we are looking at it is that we are, it's first not quite an answer to your question, and hopefully it is. We're looking at 3 thematic areas for our work. So the data piece, the openness piece, and the accountability piece. And then within that, the sectors we're looking at, for example, in terms of data, we're looking at the intersection of AI, health, and human welfare, right? We're looking at the intersection of AI and climate and sustainability. I can send you the whole list. When it comes to the accountability piece, we're looking at trust and safety. So we're looking at basically 10 different areas overall. And we're not, as much as possible, like maybe a different take a little bit as an answer to your question is we've tried as much as possible to be functional in the areas that we've picked. So for example, like science data is one of them, data provenance is another one, and areas that will be helpful to a wide variety of different cases. So it's not up to us to dictate. It's not up to us sort of top down, I think, to say, here are the areas where artificial intelligence will be most in the public interest. For that type of work, we do have a program which is about public deliberation, and we'll invest in and support work, with people who are thinking about public deliberation as to where AI should be or shouldn't be used in different ways. So a lot of what we're doing is more in terms of kind of like diagonal work, which hopefully will be, impactful, whether you're looking at labor, education, or others. I think health is probably the exception there.
Yeah, I feel like something I see in like the research world, especially in the kind of AI for social good branding of this, is like there's a lot of contention about what AI for social good really means, and a lot of like, oh, is a big tech corporation the one who like gets to decide we're gonna like drop into this community and say technology is helpful in this particular case. So I think, yeah, your point about like deliberation about what it even means to which communities are actually interested in being served by this technology. I feel like that's often like the trickiest question is like, where is this even really going? And is that
totally. Yeah, totally. And just like, and we're trying, I don't love the moniker sort of AI for good. I definitely don't feel that that's what we're doing. We're focusing on the infrastructure layer, rather than being like, okay, here's a project which will, do X, Y, Z pace. Yeah. So.
And just to touch on that, I think also there's stuff where like once it's like where you need the public in AI, right? Like you hear this debate about policing a lot, like what the challenges of policing and so on. But would you prefer the public in policing or private policing in a sort of general sense that actually a public approach is the one that creates at least the greatest level of sort of transparency and accountability. So it's sort of putting the public into AI where it currently doesn't exist, which I think is equally important. Thanks, Martin. That was awesome. Really cool. One of the things that we've been really excited about at this network, and when we kicked this off, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, is we always get very excited when we see other people starting to pick up the ideas, and I think we've seen Mozilla have come out with a public AI paper, and we were very excited that you guys were leading on that at the Paris AI Summit, and it sounds like maybe in India that we'll have something similar next year. And then perhaps sometimes we see OpenAI and Microsoft doing the same, and that's sort of they're sort of also exciting, but perhaps not quite the same way. And so I was interested, like, what do you make of these sort of the Microsoft commitments to Europe and OpenAI's like OpenAI for countries, and the sort of the move, the sort of the wholesale move over the last sort of 2 or 3 months? Palantir is obviously the best example of the big tech players into this field. And is that something that you see as like, yes, finally an opportunity to engage with people who can scale my thinking or the work that we do, or is this something that we need to be a bit more concerned about?
This is the bit where it's still recorded, right?
We can come back to it. Let's come back to it.
No. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's.
Let's come back to it.
I'm happy to say on record. I mean, I think that soften my language a little bit. I think it takes a certain amount of irony for OpenAI to write in it that like this is a move. And I remember when they wrote it like 10 days ago, which will, I won't quote them directly, but basically help have more competition in the marketplace, and like help alleviate the concentration of market power. I mean, like, I think if we and others have helped make the case for public AI broadly, great. But then we need to be clear what we're talking about. We are not talking about proprietary systems. We're talking about truly open systems, right? We're not talking about vendors going into countries who understandably, as companies are working in the private interest for their company, and I'm all for that. I'm not anti-capitalist, So great, do your thing. But that is different from working purely in the public interest. And back to the sort of Katie's question earlier, we are not saying what's in the public interest to people. What we want to be doing is investing and supporting the tools and infrastructure for people to be able to decide what outcomes they would like artificial intelligence to support or not. And that, it strikes me, is very different from saying, here is a product that I developed. I want to create more incentives for you to use my product and my overall suite and tool of products. So, I'm like, do your thing. Sort of my approach to that, but I think it's fundamentally quite different.
I can't wait to come back to this in the spicy portion. Liz.
Hey, I'm Liz Barry, newish executive director at MetaGov. Thank you so much for this presentation, and nice to see a lot of you here in this call. So I was going to ask a question about deliberation. We can choose to take it later. But Martin, thank you. You were speaking of how the public should be involved, and there is now a world full of AI-related assemblies going on. I realize this is not the topic of your call, but if you have any reflections on the way these have gone, how populations have been after they've been supported to deliberate about the role of AI in their lives, and in what way AI would be delivered to them, and possibly hunger for anything different. Thanks.
So I'm going to do something a little bit sneaky here because I see that Tim is next in the queue. So we have one of the experts in public deliberation who's about to ask a question or make a comment. So I'm going to punt it a little bit. I'm not an expert in public deliberation. I've supported different efforts there. My take would be one, it's needed, we want to finance it. I am agnostic as to the tools. What I'm not agnostic about, sorry, is when it comes to the scale. I think we need to find a way to do that on a much larger scale that's been the case to date. And this is where I'll pass it over to Tim, sorry, Tim, which is like where I've seen the rubber hit the road in a really interesting way is at a really local level. So when it comes, for example, it's an example I used to give a lot around data trust, and I think it was a chain of hospitals in the United Kingdom around Manchester. Really good work in terms of like patients of these hospitals having a say as to how patient data was being used. That's great, but we need to be able to do that and make it sort of like very effective and relevant at a policy level, at a national, regional, and then global level. How do we do that? What does it look like? That's what I'm interested in supporting the most and understanding where the best work is. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in really quick on behalf of Liz here because I think she's gesturing at some national scale data flywheel work with, for example, Sweden in this case, to try to figure out how can we build on top of these deliberative kind of existing deliberative flows, some sort of sustainable data flywheel as a attempt.
Okay, and definitely we can come back to that data flywheel kind of piece. I think, yeah, my question was going to be something different, but I'll come to the deliberation piece, which I think the big thing we've been thinking a lot about is power, is how do these processes dock into decision making, exactly as Martin says, at the right scale. So I think that is about building the capacity for very local democratic conversations about how we want to adopt AI, but also building the global conversations that say what decisions are being made at a infrastructural level and how do we have meaningful public input into those infrastructural questions. I'll put in a chat in the chat the paper we did around what are the potential models for global deliberation. And I think, though, I heard in what you said, Martin, as well, that really interesting piece about the evidence of impact at the local level, because I think one of the other things deliberation to date has tended to do is ask quite abstract questions rather than really grounding the evidence of where is AI entering people's lives and how, which was where my question was going, because I was really struck by your comment on industry players who aren't the big tech firms, the big global firms, but not the tech firms who have insights into where AI is affecting people's lives. And a couple of the most interesting public engagement exercises I took part in last year were essentially middle managers of retail firms listening to the public about what the public think about AI, and the middle managers kind of feeling caught between top-down push to adopt AI in everything they're doing and hearing from their constituents, well, that doesn't solve the problem that our publics, our customers are kind of grappling with. So I don't know quite how to form the question, but I think there's something about how you're seeing that business engagement piece linking with public voice and deliberation and hearing from people, because so often we do deliberation as a public sector or voluntary sector exercise, and we don't tend to tap in enough to the power of firms to be understanding what's happening at scale around the world.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know. I'm not going to sort of like, make up an answer on the spot for you there, Tim. It would do us all a disservice. I think it's a really great question to ask. We're asking the question. I think it's super important. I don't have good examples of that, and I wish I did, and I look forward to having them. I'm going to take advantage. There was a comment in the chat there by Lorelei Kelly. I just want to speak to this one a little bit. This piece about like what are the outcomes that people want, and agree like it's super important. I think we also need to frame it in a different way. Like one of the big takeaways, we did this AI sort of convening in Sausalito in California in June 23. And one of the big things that I took away from that is that like we need to have outcomes-based AI. The problem with saying that is it sounds like really wonky. If you go and try and convince a bunch of people that you're going to change the world because you want outcomes-based AI, like it's not going to happen. So I just wanted to make a plug. There's this it's not your point, Tim, about the businesses, but it is a point about framing. There's this in France. There's this book by an Italian guy who everyone's been reading, called Les Prédateurs, or the Predators. And the last chapter is about the mayor of this small town in the suburbs of Paris, in the south of Paris. And I was at an event with him a couple of weeks ago in Paris. And he is the mayor of a town where Waze has been routing the traffic through his town, right, to save 6 minutes, and has completely ruined the life of this small town. And he is really very eloquent about it. And I was really struck because this point that Lorelei makes in the chat there, when I was talking about what the outcomes are, in French, he says, like, as mayor, what I'm interested in are the finalités citoyennes, like, which is, in French, it works. It's like the citizen outcomes. And Ways, what they're interested in are the finalités économiques, the economic outcomes, which is kind of the same point to onto the question about, like, is it the same deal that OpenAI and Microsoft are doing in different countries? Fine. Like, they're focused, let's just be clear about what they're focused on, and then let's figure out what the role for those, for example, mayors, I think is a really good one, who are responsible for ultimately like public-centered outcomes. And so, Tim, to your point in terms of like public deliberation and how do we do it at the right scale, I think it would be interesting to work and to build on the work done, with associations of mayors and others. I've been speaking to Bloomberg about this because they've done so much with mayors in terms of climate, and would love to dig that more. Maybe some of you are already doing this work.
I'm going to cut in here and ask everybody in the next 3 seconds to please unmute and join me in a raucous round of applause for Martin for an incredible session. So 3, 2, 1. Sometimes you can also say clap, 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 because Zoom has a tendency to mute the actual clapping. Thank you so much, Martin. I'm going to pause the recording now.